สสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings. Good evening. One of the words you learn in Thailand is often used by the forest meditation masters is toraman, jit. Jit means jitta, it's in mind. Toraman means to make trouble for, go against, frustrate. So put them together and you get to give your mind trouble or to go against your mind, which sounds like creating suffering, and it may well mean that in the short term. But if you expand the term, it means to go against one's craving, all the unwholesome, unskillful desires which are coming up in our mind all the time and that you encounter when you practice meditation. So when they're teaching meditation, they're always talking about giving your kilesas a hard time or going against them, frustrating them. Sometimes it's even translated as to torture your defilements. Which doesn't sound very attractive as an activity, but nevertheless, if you want to abandon defilements, that's what you have to do. You have to go against them, which sets up some pressure or friction. When you go against something, you push against something, you go against it, then there's some pressure. A bit like when you walk around here at night and you encounter a wombat. And wombats, they tend to hold their ground, so if you bump into it, it won't give way. It'll push against you, and you'll push against it. It's a bit like that. But in your mind, pushing against thoughts that are rooted in, or desires, rooted in greed, anger and delusion, is a big part of our training. And that's one reason why people are a little bit reluctant to commit to meditation sometimes, because they think it's going to be difficult and set up this friction in their mind as they try to establish mindfulness, maybe by following the breath or reciting the word Buddha. And then all kinds of desires come up that take your mind elsewhere, and you have to bring it back. And that activity of, that action of putting your mind on the breath, paying attention to the breath, pulling it away from all the other things it wants to do, doesn't sound attractive. So often people don't even want to try in the beginning. Seems sometimes almost also because we're not, in the beginning of our meditation, we're not always skilled yet. We're not experienced. And sometimes people just try to force their mind to stay with the breath, and that act of forcing can be mentally unpleasant. And they try too hard, so sometimes people get a headache, or common problem is they grit their teeth together because they're trying too hard, or they clench their fists, or they get a headache. They're trying to force their mind. So they have good intention, they want to meditate, They want to train their mind to let go of greed, anger, delusion, pacify the mind, bring it to peace. But maybe they're trying too hard, so they actually find it difficult to sustain much effort, and then they perhaps give up. And we don't like being forced to do anything in life. When we're kids, we don't like being told what to do by our parents, by teachers. When you go to work, even though you do what you're told because you want to earn money, often you begrudge the one telling you. We don't like receiving instructions. We don't like policemen telling us what speed we should be driving our car. We don't like going through customs when we go overseas. People checking passports, visas, telling us where to go, what to do. There's all kinds of situations in life we don't like being told what to do. And that will come up when we meditate. If you tell your mind, watch the breath, then the mind doesn't want to do it, does it? It starts thinking about 101 other things. And you say, come back to the breath. You get a reaction. That's mental defilement at work. Resisting, we say resisting the Dhamma. Resisting your efforts to establish mindfulness. So particularly these days, our culture is one where we praise people who have lots of freedom. Usually we associate that with being wealthy, powerful, influential, and you're powerful enough to not have to follow the rules, or you've got enough money to get round the rules, or all the things that you don't want to have to do. You don't have to because you've got enough money. That's our goal, and we see that as kind of freedom, not having to be told what to do all the time. But as soon as you start meditating, you realize you're constantly being told what to do, but not by another person, but by your kilesas. Your desires, they come up and they're often very strong, powerful, habitual, addictive, and they're combined with delusion, so most of the time we're not even aware of them affecting us. Because delusion, by its nature, is deluding. You don't see, you don't know. So we're affected by different kinds of unskillful negative desires, or what we call craving, tanha. And the Buddha compared that to being like a slave, having this terrible slave driver, taskmaster always bossing you around. And really that's worse than any external authority figure or kind of person in society who might be bossing you around. Your own kilesas are doing it far more, it's just we don't notice it. One reason we don't notice is because we haven't practiced enough mindfulness or awareness in the past, so we're just used to our own mental defilements pulling us around, pulling the mind around. So as soon as you start practicing meditation, so you say, I'm going to sit still for half an hour or 1 hour, your mental defilements resist. And they say, no, I'm not. I'm going to move, or get up, or do something else, or at the very least think of something else. If you have enough discipline to sit still, that's already a small victory over mental defilement. But then on the thinking level, the imagination may still be wandering around all over the place, refusing to fall into line, refusing to follow the instructions, refusing to observe the breath or whatever meditation you're doing. Your mind can still wander away, fall asleep, or imagine all kinds of things for ages before it comes back to the meditation object. So we're quite used to following this slave master of mental defilement, and we don't even realize it much of the time. We're half asleep, or as Ajahn Chah said, we're half dead. 5 minutes without mindfulness is like 5 minutes being dead. Your mind is like a ghost floating around, no longer connected to the body or aware of the body, and just floating around thinking of all the things it wants to think of, but not guided by mindfulness or wisdom. So that's why when we come to meditate, even an activity as simple as following the sensation of the in-breath and the out-breath, it can already set up some tension, and it can be tiring, frustrating, because the mental defilements don't agree to what you're doing. They say, no, we're going to have fun, think about all the things we like, or we're going to get moody and grumpy and think about all the things we don't like, or we're just going to get lost into daydreaming and fantasizing and then eventually fall asleep, perhaps. And that's how the defilements fight back. So we have to learn how to train them, discipline them with the power of the practice. And that's where this word toraman comes in, where you have to sometimes go against your desires. You say no, you refuse to engage with craving, and you set up the opposite of craving. So if you're craving a sense object, something that produces desire for some kind of satisfaction, pleasure, something you want to see, hear, taste, touch, smell, if that comes up, you have to establish mindfulness that's strong enough to turn away or let go of that desire for whatever the sense pleasure is. You have to be able to refuse to follow that desire. And that's where there'll be some tension, because one moment you have mindfulness and say, I won't think about that. And the next moment you are thinking about it, because you've lost your mindfulness and you start thinking about that sense pleasure. And that's where we have to discipline ourselves, endure, be patient, frustrate the defilement, torture the mind, but with the Dhamma in a good way, if that's the word you're going to use. Perhaps it's too strong a word, but sometimes that's the word we use. You have to bring up the strength of mind through mindfulness practice and training, and then use some insight, wisdom as well. So with, for example, with a sense pleasure, seeing its impermanence. Oh, it's just that much. It's just something you want to think about, some sight, some pleasure, some memory. It arises, passes away. And when you have an awareness of impermanence, maybe that helps you to let go. When you forget impermanence, or even if you know impermanence but you're just not strong enough to maintain that insight, your mind goes chasing after the object of desire again. So it's constantly setting up tension as you practice meditation, but that tension in the short term, you might consider it some form of suffering, but in the long term it's actually leading to a place where you go beyond suffering, to true freedom, true liberation of mind. It's just in the beginning, if we haven't experienced this liberation, you have to take it on trust, by listening to teachers, the Buddha. And then you put it into practice, and that may take time, depending on your accumulated varami, your effort, all the different factors. Everyone's different. So often we like to listen to the Dhamma from teachers who have practiced ahead of us, so get an idea how to deal with some of these mental defilements which come up as we meditate. And really the bhikkhu life, the monk's life, is dedicated to meeting with defilement and overcoming defilement. So part of the bhikkhu life, the monk's life, is like training yourself, disciplining yourself to deal with sense desire, aversion and delusion. You know, we live in poverty, simplicity. We don't handle money or have many possessions. We just have our robes and our bowl. So that's already a discipline in itself. So many monks, when they begin their practice, it's quite common to undertake one of the ascetic practices, just eating food in your bowl. They call it the one vessel practice. You just have a bowl, whether it's steel or iron, or even it could be clay. You just have one vessel and you eat your one meal out of this one vessel, and all the food goes into the one vessel or the one bowl. You don't have other plates and dishes. All the food is in one thing, just like your stomach, and that's how you're taught to look at it. Just as you put all your food in your one bowl and eat your one meal in one sitting, so it's called the one sitter's practice as well. Similarly, you put all the food in your stomach and it all mixes in there in your stomach, one meal's worth or one day's worth of food. But that is quite a disciplined practice, especially in the beginning when you still have a lot of desire for food, different types of food, and maybe you want your soups and drinks and sweets and desserts separate from the bowl. You want them outside in plates and cups and dishes. So it'll bring up tension. Just eating your meal will already be a matter of disciplining yourself if that's the practice you're doing. Sometimes monks, they've undertaken to just eat their one meal in one sitting at one time in the one vessel, the one bowl. And then things come up to test their commitment to that training and that discipline. So the most exciting version of this I can remember is when some forest monks were in the forest eating their food. They collected from the village in their bowls and they sat down in a line to eat their meal, and then a herd of elephants came rushing through and they all had to get up, leave their bowls and move out of the way of the elephants, because elephants can be lethal. But then they'd got up in the middle of their meal, so they actually missed most of their meal because they'd only just begun eating. But they were keeping to this rule very strictly, so they didn't continue at their meal after the elephants had gone. They tipped the food out for the forest animals and just had a very small meal that day because they were keeping the rule. And this is the kind of commitment and discipline that sometimes is required as you're training your mind. It's not just sitting for an hour in meditation, but taking on other rules as well. Sometimes it's rules from the monk's life, the Vinaya training. Sometimes it's rules you make up yourself. So I used to live with a monk who was determined to attain samadhi, and he knew he'd have to be very disciplined and sit and walk meditation often for many hours. So he made a rule for himself. He'd sit up for much of the night, and he said, if I start nodding off, meaning giving in to my sleepiness, then the next day I'm not going to eat at all. So he found that the fear of not eating kept him alert, because he didn't want to miss his meal the next day, so he didn't fall asleep. So he'd sit up straight. And gradually he trained himself to be mindful and let go of his sleepiness, and he did it very well. So he attained samadhi. Or another monk, he had a rule that he made for himself. He found, he was a young monk, new monk, and he found he was really obsessed with food. Because as a monk there's not much outlet for your sensual desire. So he made a rule, if once he leaves the monastery on alms round, we'd walk into the village, collect food at different houses, and then come back and eat the meal. He said once he left the monastery on alms round, walk into the village, if the thought came up, in his mind, what am I going to get in my bowl today? What kind of food will they offer? Will it be to my liking? Will it be what I want? What kind of curry? What kind of sweet? What kind of fruit? If those thoughts come up, I'll turn around and walk back to the monastery, and I won't eat that day. So very occasionally you'd see him walking down the road and suddenly he'd turn around and come back to the monastery and he'd fast that day. And you know it's because he started thinking about food as he's wandering along the road. He lost his mindfulness. Usually when you walk on arms round, you have a mindfulness object, like following the feeling of your feet, touching the ground, or reciting Buddha, or even following the breath if you're good at it. But he obviously had lost his awareness of his meditation object, so he started thinking about food and saying, no, I'm not going to indulge in this thought, and go back to the monastery and just fast for the day. And this is what we call toraman, or going against the mental defilements, not giving in to them, not giving them power, not giving that voice in the mind power to take over the mind. So basically learning how to say no, resist. It can be sense desires, it can be aversion, same. There's a famous incident, they say, one time when Lumpur Cha was teaching at Wat Pah Bong, and there was a very naughty novice monk. And he had to discipline the novice monk, but he had to use strong words and really be very firm with him, because the novice was very undisciplined, unmindful, naughty novice. So Lumpur Cha gave him strong words, and then people were thinking maybe he got angry. They're not sure because it's a personal thing. But Lumpur Cha disappeared into his kuti, and they say he didn't come out for 3 days. And they thought maybe it was because he'd given into a moment of anger. So he's teaching himself. Just disappeared. Didn't eat, didn't come out for a few days. And if you really want to get hold of your mind, you have to be quite firm as you practice. You can make your own rules, or you use the rules like the precepts, or if you're meditating, you use determination, resolutions. You say, I'm going to sit for a certain amount of time. I'm not going to move until that time is completed. I'm not going to get up. I'm not going to uncross my legs, say. Or if you're walking meditations, I'm going to walk for half an hour or an hour. This is how we train. Another word they use for it in India in the time of the Buddha is dabba, tapa. In Thai we say dabba. It means like ascetic discipline. Well, literally means burning up mental defilement through your commitment and training and discipline. So it might be you decide to sit meditation for a certain amount of time, and whatever thought comes up, you're bored, you're fed up, you've got some pain or discomfort in your legs, you're distracted, you're sleepy, you're tired, you're not going to give in to those desires that might make you want to stop meditating. You have dabba. Then they have this phrase in Thai, say dabba dek. You break your discipline, or your discipline falls apart. So you said, I'm going to sit for an hour, but after half an hour there's so much pain, or you're itchy, or just so restless that you give up. And you say you've broken your discipline, you've broken your commitment, or you say everything falls apart. It could be other things. Sometimes people take on a rule that we call noble silence. Says, I'm not going to speak today. Maybe they've noticed they talk unmindfully a lot of the time. So they're going through the day, and then something comes up and just tempts them to say a few words, and then they realize, they've lost their discipline, started speaking again. So there's many different rules and trainings we can do. But the idea is to bring up certain qualities of mind that help you to go against mental defilement and train against it, actually abandon, stop indulging in mental defilement. It's not easy, but if you want to really change for the better, we've got to learn to discipline ourselves. And that's what you're learning in meditation, keeping precepts, any part of the Buddhist path that you're learning or training yourself. Practicing dana is a training, isn't it? Sometimes people tell me they had a plan to offer dana. They actually cooked the food and got it ready to come to the monastery, and then they changed their mind. They said, oh, can't be bothered at all. Some other mood entered their mind, which you might say is a craving or defilement, and they change their mind, and they don't carry through with that act of dana. Even acts of generosity require commitment, discipline, and going against certain defilements. When I was a young monk, we used to occasionally visit other teachers or invite them to the monastery. Recently we invited Lumpur Damrong from Thailand here. Because often you meet different teachers and they'll give you their own little techniques and stories of their own battles with mental defilements, with fear, with laziness, with greed and lust, with anger, with worry. So sometimes it's helpful to hear other practitioners, could be lay people, could be monastics, and they give you encouragement. I remember when I was just a few reigns, there was one monk who lived in central Thailand, Ayutthaya, called Lumpur Du. He's already quite old by then, in his 70s. And Lumpur Du was considered to be a very advanced, enlightened meditation master. He was very humble, and Ajahn liked to go and visit him. Ajahn was from Ayutthaya province, and Lumpur Du lived in Ayutthaya. He was a very humble monk, but very bright, peaceful monk. He didn't talk a lot. He was kind of reserved with his words. But when he did talk, he talked a lot about training the mind and this practice of dabba or toraman, torturing the defilements, going against defilements, learning not to give in to the defilements. He said that he learned that living in the forest. Because when he became a monk, it was like from about 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, when most of Thailand was forest. So most monks lived in the forest or near the forest in those days, which was full of wild animals, disease, very little food and support, very little medical care. So pretty much every monk had to live quite ascetically and faced a lot of challenges. And he was one. So he said he talked to us about his challenges. He said he actually became a monk because he wanted to learn samadhi, how to make his mind very calm, still and powerful. But he said in the very first year as a monk, he wasn't yet really thinking of Nibbana. Like so many people, Nibbana seemed like quite a far-off ideal. He said his main aim was to gain invincibility because his family had been robbed by a gang of thieves twice in previous years, and these thieves were quite violent and they stole a lot of stuff, wealth from his family. So he wanted to learn meditation to make himself invincible to weapons and make his mind really strong so he could battle these thieves. He wanted revenge. So he said he actually ordained for revenge. It's not what you might think as a monk who later becomes enlightened. But it's quite common when you're young, you're full of other things in your mind. So one of his desires was to get revenge on these thieves. So training his mind, make himself beyond fear and totally impervious to weapons. So he practiced like that for a while, and then his own innate wisdom and understanding grew, and because he was a monk, he was hearing the Dhamma and chanting, listening to Dhamma. He realized he had the wrong view, the wrong idea, so he gave up that idea, and now after a year or two in the robes he wanted to practice for Nibbana. But because he was so determined to train himself, he said he was happy to exchange his very life for Nibbana. That's the kind of attitude that came up, he said, after a few years in the robes. Whatever the obstacle, whatever the difficulty, he was willing to go through it for Nibbana, for the end of suffering, out of gratitude to the Buddha and his teachers. So he said that attitude meant he got very quick progress in working with his defilements. He's really determined to learn how to meditate with discipline, sitting and walking meditation for many hours a day. But he said everything else pales into significance if you really commit your whole life for practicing for Nibbana, then nothing else seems very important. So if you've got a bit of pain or illness, he said, doesn't matter. You endure through it, you practice patience. If you have desires for other more sort of worldly things, just to go off and have fun, doesn't seem important compared to Nibbana. So he centered his mind on practicing for Nibbana. And he was very determined, so he kept training himself. He said in the beginning he used the recollection of one of the bodhisattvas who used to live in Ayutthaya, where he lived. This monk we've got on the shrine behind me, Lumpur Tuat, who lived in the time when Ayutthaya was the capital of Thailand, about 300 years ago. And he had very good samadhi and psychic powers, but he's also very wise, good teacher, and he led a revival of Buddhism in Thailand at that time. So he recollected Lumpur Tuat to get strength when he was out in the forest dealing with, faced a lot of illness because being in the forest, not much medication, food was often scarce. A lot of things around like malaria and other kinds of diseases. So he'd recollect Lumpur Tuat to get strength of mind, train himself. He said he had to train himself to ignore all the foolish mental chatter that would come up in his mind as he was practicing meditation. Just to say no to it, not give in to it, not feed it, not hold on to it, let it go until he attains samadhi. And he said he had to learn to be very patient with other people because not everyone is dedicated to Nibbana, even monks. Some people are studying and learning, some are more disciplined, less disciplined. So he kept recollecting Lumpur Tuat to gain strength of mind, and he eventually attained his samadhi, and then he practiced contemplating his body. See the impermanence and unattractive nature of his own body. When he taught, he would keep referring to the practice of patience, endurance, effort, and then torturing the kilesas. Not torturing yourself, torturing the kilesas. Kilesas are not self. They're mental states rooted in greed, anger, delusion. You have to learn how to torture them rather than have them boss you around. Which is a skill that you have to learn through experience. And of course, sometimes you get it wrong. You try too hard, and then other times you don't try hard enough. And the kilesas are all over you, and they win. by the time he was in his 70s, and when I became a monk, he spent most of his time teaching because he became so popular. People would come to see him, very much like Ajahn Chah, come to see him from morning until evening. And so he actually developed terrible infected buttocks because he was sitting, teaching all day, all night, just without getting up very much. Just occasionally maybe get up, go to the toilet. No one knew, only the monks who were closest to him knew. His whole backside became infected because he was just sitting so much, like bed sores. It was just from sitting, teaching people. And the monk said, well, why don't you rest more, stop teaching? He said, no. We have to practice like the Buddha practicing for Nibbana. Can't give in to a few desires to want to stop meditating or stop teaching or stop doing our practice. We have to carry on even if there's a bit of pain or discomfort. That was his level of determination. Right to the day he died. The day he died, he was still teaching. He died from, if I remember, I think a heart attack. He was teaching right to the very last day of his life. And his legs were covered in sores from sitting so much. But he never displayed any signs of discomfort. He was very bright, radiant, kind of citta, radiant mind. So encountering those who have practiced before us, senior monks, people who have meditated, monks, nuns, even lay people who have practiced well maybe for many years, you see there are certain recurring qualities that they have. The dedication to Nibbana, the dedication to the precepts, dedication to practicing mindfulness, dedication to training themselves, not giving in to the defilements. This is what we have to learn. And you learn little by little. You start with small things, just learning to sit still for, say, 10 minutes without moving, and then you build up to 30 minutes, 1 hour, a few hours. And as you do that, you find your mindfulness becomes stronger, your ability to let go of different mental states, see them as temporary, see them as not self, that improves, and so you can let go of more. You let go of the small things first, and then the bigger, deeper, more deeply ingrained mental defilements, you can let go of them later as your mind becomes stronger. So just a few recollections tonight, recollections of Lumpur Du, recollections of the practice. Maybe I'll leave it there and we can end the session.